My name is David Fullard. This is my presentation transitioning from FreeNAS to FreeBSD. It's probably going to be one of the least technical talks here because this is from a user perspective, and I'm going to talk a bit about community at the end. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm a system administrator within the air transport industry. I've mostly been working with Red Hat, and I've been in this, we'll say the air transport industry, but IT for the last 14 years. This is my third conference and first time speaking. And I will warn you now, I'm very new to presenting. So if I make mistakes or repeat myself, I do apologize. And I assure you that I do in fact run FreeBSD at home, even though I do work with Red Hat. So how I got started with FreeNAS initially, so 5 years ago, I was looking for somewhere to store files, movies, music, TV shows, home videos, family photos, and and I was planning originally to buy an off-the-shelf system, where Synology, QNAP, Buffalo, D-Link. There's a whole load out there. But work one day, a friend of mine said, well, hey, why don't you check out FreeNAS? I'm like, well, what's FreeNAS? I didn't even know what it was. So I started looking at it, and I ended up going down the rabbit hole looking at FreeNAS, and it intrigued me. I like open source. At the time I was fairly familiar with Linux. And I ended up going down looking for suitable hardware, and I ended up building, I think, a Xeon system with ECC RAM and everything. But before I even got to that, I pretty much read the FreeNAS manual twice before even considering installing it, and even in a virtual machine, just so I could actually understand, because this was going to be storing my family's data. They'd be storing, photos I don't want to lose, especially like photos of my kids and that. So many years later, like 3-4 years later, I now consider myself a power user at this point, and what does that mean to become a FreeNAS power user? So to me, that means contributing back to the community, helping others, whether it's in the forum, the chat room, regardless of their capability. I mean, hell, I was new once, and and this was my way of giving back from what I received through FreeNAS. From that, I created a couple of video tutorials which were on the forums. They were posted on YouTube. This was very FreeNAS 101 sort of videos. For somebody who's just coming in and starting to use it. Participating in the IRC chat room, helping others. Recently, I've been sort of given moderator privileges, so I try and keep spammers out on that these days. The other thing I've done, I've filed my fair share of bug reports and feature requests. One of them, I don't know if you use FreeNAS, but there was one I jokingly created to use Comic Sans font in FreeNAS Corral. But that actually evolved into more of a usability sort of for the visually impaired. So this is why today you're now seeing themes now part of FreeNAS 11. But the most important thing here was the many hours of discussion I had within the community with key members. Alan Jude being one of them. Cyberjock, also known as Josh, he works with IX Systems. My friend Kyle, and forum moderator Eric Lowe. And because of these people, I learned what I learned, and was able to share it with others. Anyway, going to the video that I created, this was literally Samba permissions video on FreeNAS, and there was often lots of people coming in and saying, hey, how do I share files? How do I get permissions to work? So I created a beginner's guide, as it were. And I uploaded this video in 2016, and today I checked it when I first created these slides almost 2 weeks ago. It had 10,000 views, and I mean, that was a shock to me because I never looked at the stats until that time. And I was amazed at, the interest in it. And the YouTube analytics showed that it was still being viewed 100 times a day. So, to me, that's just an example of of me being able to give back to the community, and and it's become a valuable resource. And speaking of resources, there's the forums, the Arc Systems community, which I've been a big user of. And within the last year, I've been more and more using the FreeBSD forums. You've got the chat rooms on Freenode IRC, you have FreeNAS, the FreeNAS channel. There's also an unofficial social channel that a few of us set up, which topics outside of just FreeNAS. And then you've got the FreeBSD chat rooms. One of the community members actually set up a Mumble server so we can have real-time voice conversations. And the nice thing about that is if somebody comes onto the IRC and says, hey, I've got this problem, there could be a couple of us on the Mumble sort of talking about it, sort of behind the scenes, as it were, trying to come up with solutions and ideas on how to fix a particular issue. The BSD Now weekly podcasts by Benedict and Alan. I find these a great resource. I mean, on a Wednesday afternoon, at the office, I'll put it on in the background and just listen in. The mailing lists for FreeBSD, I mean, I've only really started using these myself in the last few months, and I'm learning a lot through that. And you've got other resources as well. I mean, a lot of people tend to use Slack these days. So continuing about resources is books that I feel are must-read books especially when transitioning to FreeNAS. I mean, this is a list of books I either want or I already own. For example, I already own the ZFS and Advanced ZFS books. In fact, I just purchased the Jails book today from Michael, who's selling out in the hallway. And I also have the SSH Mastery, but I also want to get my hands on Kirk's book, The Design and Implementation, and I'll eventually pick up absolutely FreeBSD. So anyway, my transition from FreeNAS to FreeBSD, what were my goals? So my main goal was to replicate most of the functionality I already had in FreeNAS, and which is, I want to be able to configure a failover for link aggregation and bridging, so I can give jails their own networking through VNet. Configure Samba with previous versions, so I can just go into Windows and pull out files from the ZFS snapshots. I wanted to be able to set up and manage jails. I wanted to continue monitoring my hard drives using Smart, and also configure the UPS to shut down in case of a power outage. This is all functionality that's already available in FreeNAS, and I wanted to make sure I kept this functionality. So my move to FreeBSD. So this was, I wanted to make note of all the settings I currently have in FreeNAS, the syscontrols, the tunables. Took screenshots for reference just in case I ever needed to refer back to something. Copying all the generated configuration files that FreeNAS created, just so, again, for reference. And then finally, backing up all my data, because if I screw up, I want to make sure I can actually, get back to where I was, which that's backing up not just the configuration from FreeNAS, but backing up all my data as well. So I really don't want to lose my photos and everything. So now the scary part for me was actually installing FreeBSD. So off I went, and I did a real basic setup. I created the ZFS boot, setting the host name, basic network configuration, just to get it on the network. So once I was up and running, first things first was I wanted to configure my failover, which is link aggregation. I just set up failover. I have kids, so kids are attracted to blinky lights on a network switch. So, it was sort of a preventative measure because my youngest would like to go up to the switch and pull a cable, so this was a nice to have for me. So if I was copying a file, it didn't instantly die, and I was left sitting there wondering why. And I also then created the bridge interface. So within the RC-conf, and from the handbook, I learned to configure a cloned interface, to set up that bridge, and and assign its IP address and everything, and tell it to use the link aggregation. And then finally, I actually discovered this much later when my jails didn't really work properly, was you got to turn on IP forwarding. So now I've got my basic network configuration going. I then want to, set up my ZFS. Now, I had a choice at this point. Do I import my existing pool from FreeNAS, or do I create a new one? Well, if I just import it, I'm not going to learn anything. So my data's already backed up. So I thought, well, why not? Why don't I just create the pool from scratch? This way, I learn how to set it up how I want and configure it. And my data's backed up, so who cares at this point? But it takes much more time to get going again. But I learn more along the way. So what did I learn? Simple things like setting a mount point. I wanted my home directories to be on the pool I just created. So setting the property mount point for /home. One thing I didn't realize was FreeNAS will actually set LZ4 compression for you automatically. That's not the case in FreeBSD, so that was a learning thing for me. Configuring snapshots using the ZFS tools. So, I want to make sure I have regular ongoing snapshots. One thing I learned about the snapshots, though, is to disable A-time, because every time you access a file, the metadata gets updated, and when ZF tools kicks in at the next scheduled time, it then creates another snapshot, and you end up with a long list of snapshots. And yeah, and eventually they rotate to the point where you can't actually recover that file you just deleted, yesterday. And then finally setting record size for media data sets. And one thing I learned was by increasing the record size and disabling encryption, especially for when you're storing, like myself, my movies and TV shows, I'm actually finding that I was actually saving space. It wasn't a lot of space. It was like a few gigabytes, but those few gigabytes can be used elsewhere, and it's just a nice way to save a little bit of storage along the way. Now, configuring snapshots, I discovered the utility ZFS utils, and I understand this is a clone of something that came from Solaris. So, documentation sort of readily available for it, which is nice. And the good thing is when you install it, it actually says, hey, here's an example cron tab, and you know what, that cron tab works for me. Let me just put it in there. That's fine by me. And then I enable the snapshots for the whole pool. My data doesn't change very often, but obviously these can be set up per data set, and you can say, well, I only want daily snapshots on this data set, etc. So now I've got my ZFS working how I want. I now want to configure Samba, and I wanted to replicate what I had in FreeNAS with the previous versions or shadow copies. So after much Googling and much man-page reading, I came up with this sort of, this is a cut-down version or an extract from the Samba configuration, just so I could actually get those snapshots to show up in Windows, because most of my computers at home, my desktop, my laptop, it's all Windows. And then with that, I wanted to continue learning how to set permissions using get, using get and set FACL. And one thing that came to my attention was the latest version of Windows 10 no longer supports guest shares out of the box. So it's like, okay, well, there's a couple ways around that. You can set a password, which is the easiest way to do. Or you can you can create or edit a local group policy object, or is a registry key modification to allow that. So, but when you've got other family members that you don't want to tell them, hey, modify your group policy, no, just enter a password. It's much easier. The next thing, now I've had my file sharing sorted out. Next thing was jails. So I decided to go with IOCage. It's what's in FreeNAS, so I'm already familiar with it. I'm already familiar with the command line syntax. So, you know, it made sense just to continue using it. I configured my jails to use VNet, created a bridge, which I did earlier, which you saw in the presentation. So, and then I also looked at what other jail management tools that there are, and there's the standard jail.conf. You've got to do a lot of things manually. You've got to bring in, you know, the base bundle and everything. A lot of the community likes to use EasyJail, which again is, you know, I did play with it. It's very nice to use, very simple to use. There's also CBSD. CBSD is actually pretty cool because not only does work with jails, it also works with Beehive. So if you want to use, you know, pre-virtual machines using Beehive, that's an excellent tool to use. And as I was saying, and then there's a whole slew of different tools that can be used, and you know, there's a whole wiki page pretty much dedicated to it. Sure. Anyway, now I've got my jails running. I've set up my Plex. I've set up my Unify. My next goal was to monitor my hard drives using Smart. So I'm going to omit something here. I actually borrowed the example configuration from the Arch Linux wiki, and this wiki surprisingly is very good regardless of whether you're running FreeBSD, Red Hat, Debian, whatever. There's a lot of excellent configuration examples in there, and you know, it's quite a valuable resource. And yeah, so basically all this configuration does is it does a short test every day, 2 o'clock in the morning, and then on a Saturday at 3 a.m. it will kick off doing a long test on all the drives. I've done this for pretty much to just scan for any attached drive and do a smart test. So, and then from here, it checks for temperature changes. So I like to get a warning if it drops below 10 degrees, and if it drops below 10 degrees, then there's something terribly wrong with the heating at home. And above 45 degrees. So, and what Smart is configured to do here is to track changes every 4 degrees Celsius. So you see the 4, 10, and 45. That's what the 4 indicates there. So now I'm monitoring my drives using Smart, and this is sending an email to root, which is forwarded to my email. Then the last part of this was to set up my UPS. My UPS is a really simple APC backed UPS, tiny little thing. I mean, it's not a big rack mount server that I have at home. It's, you know, it's a modest size desktop case with a bunch of drives in it. And that UPS is shared over the network using my pfSense firewall running APC UPSD. And that's configured on pfSense for maximum uptime. I want to, might want to carry on using the internet because my phone is, voice over IP. So I want to make sure I can still use the phone in case of a power outage. And then my FreeBSD server is, set to shut down either when there's 10 minutes remaining on the battery or 20% of battery life remaining. So. And here is just a very short example of that configuration on FreeNAS, and it's pretty much how it comes out of the box. So next thing is keeping up to date. So FreeNAS is easy. There's a release. You hit the update button, and off you go. It reboots. You're done. FreeBSD is not like that. So I subscribed it to the FreeBSD announcement mailing list, so I can see what advisories are coming in, whether they impact me. And the nice thing about that, there's workarounds. So if I can't apply the update right away, I can at least do it, set up the workaround. There's cron with I've configured cron with FreeBSD updates as per the FreeBSD handbook. And then package is running package upgrades, making sure, like things like Samba and all that. Actually, with package, I've configured it to use the frequent repository opposed to the quarterly, because I like to I like to keep stuff, up to date as much as possible. And finally, Portmaster. Now, Portmaster, Alan Jude made fun of me for using this. So I'll be looking to use Pudre in the future for building ports and creating local packages. So why did I move to FreeBSD from FreeNAS? Well, I wanted to expand my knowledge. I mean, I'm a system administrator at work, so I like to figure out why things work, and there's only so much you can do within FreeNAS before it either breaks with the next update. So this was a nice way for me to explore the operating system underneath. And the problem I had with FreeNAS eventually is that it started to feel claustrophobic in terms of customization. So let's say there's a particular thing you want to do, but pretty much next update, it's either going to break FreeNAS or FreeNAS is going to break your customization. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but for me it was, FreeNAS is an appliance and it's not your typical operating system, Unix operating system. So you've got to keep that in mind as well. The other nice thing is the flexibility of FreeBSD. I mean, it can be what you want it to be. I mean, desktop, server, I'm using it as a file server. People use it, mail, DNS, media, whatever. I mean, just look at Netflix. They're serving up, terabytes of video using FreeBSD. And finally, the awesome documentation. I mean, the handbook is fantastic, and I refer to that a lot now. And that's probably one of the best things about FreeBSD. So, what's easier to do in FreeBSD? For me, this was the operating system and package updates. So you have control over the standard mechanisms, package upgrade and FreeBSD upgrade, etc. But with FreeNAS, the problem there is that you're at the mercy of the developer's release cycle. So let's say if there's a 0-day vulnerability, in FreeBSD land, that's taken care of probably the same day or the following day. But sometimes that's the case with FreeNAS as well. But sometimes it can take a few days, a week, a month, and that has been. Well, I've personally seen that myself. But I can't speak for others on that. And then finally, getting support. I mean, it can be a mailing list, it can be the forum, IRC, and it doesn't have to be an official source. I mean, you can go to a third-party forum where you might have some FreeBSD enthusiasts, such like Reddit and other technical forums that you may use. And there's obviously FreeBSD channels on other IRC networks, up at EFNet and Delnet here, and there's hundreds. And you also have GeekShed as well, so there's plenty of places to get help. But then what's harder to do without the UI? Well, I can tell you there's definitely, from a user perspective, there's definitely much more work to configure. I mean, and more thinking and more reading, because in FreeNAS it's easy. You literally point and click and then you're done. With FreeBSD, editing configuration files, you've got to think about what you're doing, and you can screw up, and you can result in data loss and other stuff. I mean, for example, the wrong ZFS command, you could end up, deleting all your data sets if you're not careful. The other thing is, there's no single source. I've already discussed how awesome the documentation is, but it's also a problem at the same time, I feel, is there's no single source of on how to do something. So FreeBSD has that fantastic handbook for most topics, but I don't think it's a single, authoritative source. I mean, all these projects have their own documentation to go with it as well. But with FreeNAS, you have one place of your documentation, and there it is. You want to configure a Samba share, that's how you do it. You want to configure NFS, this is how you do it. I mean, it's pretty much parrot fashion. Other thing is configuring ZFS and replication tasks. Again, in FreeNAS, you click a couple of buttons and you're replicating to another FreeNAS server. But in FreeBSD, you have to either write a script yourself to do this, or there's also a project called, I believe, zRepl, which you can use to replicate to another FreeBSD. And finally, boot environments. Every time you do an upgrade in FreeNAS, a new boot environment is created. But this isn't the case in FreeBSD. You have to remember to do it yourself using, is it B control, CTL now? So, in fact, I was just discussing this the other day with Alan, saying, I like the FreeBSD upgrade command to be able to create a new boot environment, when I go ahead and write FreeBSD upgrade install. Just so I make it easier to roll back. So anyway, that was my journey going to FreeBSD, but how do we get others interested into this? I mean, you may remember this slide from 2 years ago when my friend Carl did a presentation on community dynamics, and so he questioned, how can we get more people into the community? Maybe it's a path like mine, or perhaps some other method. So what about the Linux users? How can we bring them in, into the BSD community and make it more attractive for them? So there's obviously recruitment through appliances, and FreeNAS was my way of coming into FreeBSD. But what about other appliances? And I can only come up with a handful. I mean, there's pfSense, there's OpenSense, and there's SigmaNAS, which was previously known as NAS for free, and that's pretty much where the list stopped. And I mean, if you're already running pfSense or OpenSense, you've already probably been recruited into the community. So what about commercial products? I mean, there's a few of you here using Macs, and the core is built on XNU, which is part Mac, part FreeBSD. The network administrators among us, you use Junos, which is FreeBSD. Storage administrators use NetApp filers. We use them at the data center at the office, and they're running underneath FreeBSD. And then for the kids, you've got the Nintendo Switch and the PlayStation. But the problem is with these appliances, they don't really advertise the fact they're using FreeBSD underneath. Unless you actually go into the about and the license agreement, that's the only time you get to see, oh, this is running FreeBSD, but what kid's going to go in and look at the license agreement? They just want to play their games. So what about our Linux counterparts? Well, I asked within a couple of chat rooms. I asked, how can we, bring you into the BSD community? And one of the first things that came up was make it more approachable. And I was like, well, how? And I couldn't really get an answer for that, because obviously they're not really familiar with BSD, and and I couldn't really answer it myself. A couple of technical things came up as well. Hot plug USB. I mean, for example, in Ubuntu, you plug in a USB stick, for your files, and it pops up in a window, and you copy them over and everything. You unplug it, and you're done. When FreeBSD, you pretty much plug it in. You have to mount it all manually. I know there's auto mount and there's other things you can use that assist with that, but that doesn't work out of the box, and that was that point there. And the other thing was, it was hard to track the differences between FreeBSD and OpenBSD. I mean, to me, that felt like, that's kind of like saying, well, it's hard to track the difference between Ubuntu and Debian, right? They're pretty much, based around the same thing. But again, I got some odd answers from them. So then I moved on, and I asked my sysadmin peers at the office, and and other people I know about, what can we make, not just FreeBSD, but the BSDs in general. One of the first things to come up was make it easier to use, and make it with a UI out of the box like Ubuntu. Truos and Desktop BSD, attempt to address this. So, this is a nice step in the right direction. Driver support was a big one. Linux tends to get driver support for devices like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth relatively quickly, whereas FreeBSD can tend to lag, you know, in those. Take the latest NVIDIA GPUs, the RTX 20 something, you know, or the new AMD 5700 series graphics cards. It's going to take a while for those drivers to become available in FreeBSD, whereas in Linux, a lot of that, you know, those are already being supported. Another thing that came up was developers taking part in forums. I mean, the developers take part in IRC and the mailing lists, but you'll find that newer members of the community tend to gravitate towards forums and Slack and all, you know, the latest, you know, communication technologies that are available. So, you know, that's one thing that people like to see. Informal documentation was another good point. So yes, there's the FreeBSD handbook, but it's like stereo instructions, like do this, this, this. You know, may want to do this. But for example, going back to my video earlier, I created like a FreeNAS 101 Samba permissions video, and that targeted a very you know, the person like me coming into using FreeNAS and figuring out how to use it, and hey, there's a video available that guides me step by step on how to do this. So when I talk about informal, you know, when I talk about informal documentation, you're targeting different levels of experience. So you've got the new guy, you know, may want, you know, bullet point after bullet point, whereas you've got the more advanced user which just needs hints and pointers. So, you know, just, and yeah. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for me. So if you want to contact me, you can find me on Freenode. Monkey, so that's the reference. So the picture right at the beginning of the presentation, that's why I put it up there, because I'm known as Monkey on Freenode, on Twitter, Dave, and feel free to email me if you have questions. Thank you.